Can Indonesia ever beat Singapore? There's a country smaller than Jakarta, with a population smaller than many Indonesian provinces, and almost no natural resources. Yet today, it has one of the highest GDP per capita levels in the world. That country is Singapore. And then there's Indonesia, almost 300 million people, thousands of islands, huge natural resources, one of the world's largest economies. Yet in 2025, the average economic output per person in Singapore was almost 20 times higher than in Indonesia. So, how did these two neighboring countries end up so different? And perhaps more importantly, can Indonesia ever catch up? When Singapore became independent in 1965, it wasn't the economic powerhouse we know today. It faced unemployment, housing shortages, and limited natural resources. It didn't have Indonesia's oil, or nickel, or enormous domestic market, or hundreds of millions of consumers. What Singapore did have was geography. It sat next to one of the world's most important shipping routes. And instead of treating that as simply a geographic advantage, Singapore built an economy around it. Ports, infrastructure, manufacturing, trade, finance, and eventually high-value services. Singapore's transformation wasn't instant. The World Bank describes decades of rapid growth, industrialization, and investment in infrastructure and human capital that took the country from low income to high income status. Singapore didn't discover a magic resource. It built an ecosystem, and that distinction matters. Because if resources were enough to make a country rich, Indonesia should have won a long time ago. Indonesia has an extraordinary amount going for it. Around 284 million people, a huge domestic market, major commodity reserves, a strategic location between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and an economy worth roughly $1.4 trillion in 2024. So, why is the average Singaporean still so much richer? The answer is surprisingly simple. Size creates potential, but size doesn't automatically create productivity. A country can have millions of workers, but if those workers don't have the right skills, if companies can't operate efficiently, if goods are expensive to move, or if regulations make investment harder, that potential doesn't automatically become wealth. And this is where Indonesia's challenge begins. Singapore doesn't have much land, so what exactly does it sell? The answer isn't oil, it's not minerals, and it's not cheap labor. Singapore sells something much harder to build: connectivity and trust. A company can use Singapore as a gateway into Southeast Asia. Money can flow through its financial system. Goods can move through its port. Businesses can access international markets. And highly skilled workers can operate in an environment designed around global business. This didn't happen by accident. Singapore spent decades building infrastructure, human capital, and institutions around its position as a global trading and business hub. And this is perhaps Singapore's biggest lesson. You don't have to own the resource if you can become the place where the resource, money, and people flow through. But here's where the comparison gets interesting. Indonesia doesn't need to copy Singapore because Indonesia has something Singapore can never have: scale. Nearly 284 million people, a massive consumer market, a huge workforce, and natural resources that are becoming strategically important to the global economy. Indonesia is already trying to move beyond simply exporting commodities. Take nickel. Instead of exporting only raw materials, Indonesia has pushed downstream processing and attracted investment into smelting, batteries, and electric vehicle supply chains. The bigger ambition is clear. Don't just sell the resource, capture more of the value created from it. And that's a very different economic model from Singapore's. Singapore became valuable by becoming a global hub. Indonesia could become valuable by becoming both a huge market and a major production base. But potential isn't enough, and this is where we need to be honest. The IMF's assessment of Indonesia's path toward high-income status points to several structural gaps: infrastructure and logistics, business regulation, human capital, governance, trade openness, and productivity. And that's a much harder problem than building another highway. Because the ultimate question isn't how big is Indonesia, it is how much value can each Indonesian worker create. That's productivity. And Singapore spent decades moving from labor-intensive manufacturing to capital-intensive industries, and eventually toward knowledge and innovation-driven sectors. Indonesia now faces its own version of that transition. Its population is an enormous advantage, but only if education, skills, infrastructure, and businesses can turn that population into higher productivity. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Maybe Indonesia doesn't need to beat Singapore because the two countries are already deeply connected. Singapore is one of Indonesia's most important economic partners, and the relationship is increasingly moving beyond simple trade. The two countries are working together on areas including cross-border electricity, carbon capture, digital infrastructure, and development around Batam, Bintan, and Karimun. Why? Because their strengths are complementary. Singapore has capital, global connectivity, financial expertise, and a highly developed business ecosystem. Indonesia has land, labor, natural resources, and scale. Put those together, and something interesting happens. The question stops being Indonesia versus Singapore and becomes, what can Indonesia and Singapore build together? Now, can Indonesia actually become as rich as Singapore? Nobody can honestly promise that. Indonesia would need decades of sustained productivity, growth, and structural improvement. The IMF estimates that reaching Indonesia's 2045 high-income ambition would require sustained real growth of roughly 5.5 to 6.5% annually over the next 2 decades. That's difficult, but it's not impossible, and Indonesia doesn't need to become another Singapore. It needs to solve a different problem. How do you take nearly 300 million people, thousands of islands, natural resources, a huge domestic market, and turn all of that into higher productivity and higher incomes? If Indonesia can do that, its sheer scale becomes one of the biggest economic advantages in the world. So, can Indonesia beat Singapore? Maybe that's the wrong question. Singapore spent decades proving that a country doesn't need a size to become rich. Indonesia may now have the opposite challenge. It has the size, the people, the market, the resources. What it needs is to turn potential into productivity. And perhaps the most interesting part is that Indonesia doesn't have to do it alone, because the future of these two neighbors may not be a race, but a partnership. Singapore may have shown Southeast Asia what can happen when a small country turns its geography into an advantage. Now, Indonesia has a chance to show what happens when a huge country learns to turn scale into strength. Singapore built an economy around being small, connected, and indispensable. Indonesia's challenge is becoming big, productive, and impossible to ignore.